So in this lesson, I'm going to be covering while loops or if-else commands. So the first one is while loops. So while loops allow a section of code to be repeated as long as a certain condition remains true. So in labs 1 through 3, essentially what you've done is you've started code and then you've written your lines and then it's come to an end. But in a while loop, as long as a certain condition remains true, then you can keep repeating certain lines of code, right? So as long as you have the bump switch pressed, then a certain lines of code can be repeated over and over and over again. So that's an example. So the way it would look like is in between your task main brackets, you'd have your while loop. You'd have your condition. So in the example I said, that would be when the bump switch was pressed, and then the repeated conditions could be something along the lines of the light sensor detecting whether it's light or dark and turning the flashlight on or off. Okay, so the next thing we need to look at is Boolean logic, and essentially all that is are true-false commands that you're going to be using throughout your code. And you've seen these commands before in your math classes. Essentially what that is equal to, less than and equal to, greater than, and greater than and equal to. But this is what they would look like in Robot C. So the equals command would actually be two equal signs, right? So if you wanted to say 1 is equal to 1, that's the way you would write it. Okay, so let's look at an example of what 1 and 2 would look like, putting those two together. In this case, we're going to have a while loop in between our task main brackets, and we'd write it as while loop, open the parentheses, and we'd write it exactly like this. Sensor value, open parentheses, the sensor that you're working with, in this case it's a bump switch, close the parentheses, you'd have your Boolean logic, so equal to, and then the value in this case would be 0. And then in between the curly brackets here would be the repeated condition. So in this case, it's a light sensor detecting whether it's light or dark and then turning the flashlight on or on. Okay, so the next thing we need to look at are the internal timers that Robot C has. So it has 4 internal timers, T1, T2, T3, and T4. And you can view these by going to, in Robot C, you can go under the, you can go under Robot, and then you can go to the debugger window here. And then instead of selecting motors and sensors, you would select timers. And once you select timers, you'll notice that it'll pop up into the lower window, which was going to be your debugger window. Okay, so before you can use a timer, you have to clear it. And the way you clear it is you essentially write clear timer and then whichever one you're working with. So open parentheses, in this case, T1, close parentheses, and then semicolon. And then the line of code that's after that is a while loop that actually says that while the timer is less than 30 seconds, repeat these commands. Okay, so this is exactly how you would write it if you wanted to use the timer within a while loop. So the next thing we need to look at is the if-else statement. So if-else statements is very similar to how a while loop works, but it doesn't repeat itself over and over again. Instead, it says if something is true, do this. If not, then do this. Okay, so let's take a look at what that would look like. So in between our task main brackets, we have an if command. So if sensor value of the light sensor is greater than 700, turn the flashlight on. Otherwise, turn the flashlight off. So this part is true, and then this part is when it's going to be false. Okay, so the last thing I need to mention is that when you want to use a range of values in a condition, then you'd basically write it like the following. Okay, so if you wanted to say something like, when the potentiometer is greater than 500 but less than 1,000, you would actually use these two and symbols. Okay, as follows. So in this case, it says while 1 is equal to 1, so this is my while loop, and 1 is always going to be equal to 1, and actually that should be 2 equal signs. So while 1 is equal to 1, perform the following. So basically the following is going to be performed indefinitely because 1 is always equal to 1. But basically it says if the sensor value of the potentiometer is greater than or equal to 500 and the sensor value of the potentiometer is less than or equal to 1,000, then you're going to start your motor. Okay, so this provides a range. So as long as it's between 500 and 1,000, then you can start the motor. Okay, so what you're going to be working on next is lab number 4. So if you go, 2 things. If you go under the Lessons tab, you'll see the while loop if else lesson. If you want to review that PowerPoint, you can review that PowerPoint, but essentially that's what I've covered. And if you go under the assignment tab, you will see lab number 4, and that's going to be your while loop if else lab that you're going to start working on today.